Well, what does it mean to be a skeptic? What does it mean to be an empiricist? They seem to be closely related. They're not the same thing, but they seem to be closely related. But what does it mean to be a skeptic? I think that what it means to be a skeptic is to suspend one's judgment about the truth of any of one's beliefs. Not to say that one doesn't have the truth, because that would to say that you know something if you know that you don't know. To be a skeptic is to admit that you don't have the tools to sort out which beliefs of yours are true from the ones that are false, or even knowing that any of them are true, or that any of them are false. And Descartes was in that position. Sextus remained in that position. And neither of them thought that this was any kind of absolute barrier to going ahead and living your life. Uh, Sextus describes the criterion in the first sense, not the criterion of truth, but the criterion by which the skeptic lives. Having admitted that he doesn't know whether he knows anything and that none of his beliefs have any real evidence for them, he decides to live. And he lives by the criterion, which is basically living according to the religious beliefs and customs of the country, taking the adage that you should restrain the passions, making use of the apparent fruits of the arts and sciences to make your life better and perhaps to make other lives better. It seemed like a very rational way to live, whether you're a skeptic or not. Descartes describes something quite similar in the Discourse on Method when he realizes that his education has been, by his own standards, faulty and that he doesn't know whether he knows anything. He goes ahead and lives too, having decided that all his opinions are doubtful. So in this respect, James is in no sort of unique position in the history of philosophy. He's argued for skepticism, at least so far as saying that we have no defensible criterion of truth, what constitutes objective evidence in the history of philosophy. So, what do you do now? Well, of course, you live, but cognitively, I think there's a difference here. Because James doesn't just say you go ahead and live your life not knowing whether you know anything. You go on searching for the truth, and you don't wait for a criterion of truth to emerge somehow that will vouchsafe, legitimate your beliefs as true. That is, it may be that you can accept things as true without having a criterion of truth. What does it mean to be an empiricist? Well, he says on page 30, he says, but if we are empiricists, if we believe that no bell in us tolls to let us know for certain when truth is in our grasp, then it seems a piece of idle fantasticality to preach so solemnly our duty of waiting for the bell. That is, it may be that whole bell thing, that whole click thing, which is a way of describing the criterion of truth, establishing of a criterion for objective evidence, is something that's never going to happen and may be a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to know in the first place. And here, to a certain extent, he begins to reveal the larger philosophy, the American philosophy of pragmatism. Maybe the whole notion of what truth is and how you get it has been too narrow all along. That is, that what we were looking for in a criterion of truth, at least the kind of criterion that Sextus and Descartes were looking for explicitly. Maybe that's something that doesn't exist, never could exist, and that we would never find, but that doesn't mean that we can't have truth and that we can't, in a certain sense, be sure, to a certain extent, of our opinions. Now, there's a certain attitude that's expressed here, practical attitude, and a very interesting distinction, sort of, in describing how we go on once we realize that our hold on truth is at best shaky. And he makes a very interesting distinction earlier in and that is the distinction between the command to find truth and the command to avoid error. This is on page 17, the beginning of section 7. He says there are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion, what opinions we should hold and believe in, and what ones we should not. Ways entirely different, and yet ways about whose difference the theory of knowledge seems hitherto to have shown very little concern. We must know the truth, and we must avoid error. That seems to be the philosophical spirit, scientific spirit. And these are our first and great commandments as would-be knowers, but they are not two ways of stating an identical commandment. They are two separable laws. That is, they are two guidelines, maxims, rules of thumb that we as knowers, as inquirers into reality, think are both important, but they're not expressions of the same thing. And we can show that to ourselves by showing that it may be that in some cases you have to choose the one or the other. That is, if you really believe that the imperative, we must know the truth, is the most important thing, it may be that sometimes you cannot avoid error, because in order to get the truth, you have to risk error. And it may be that if you think that avoiding error is the most important thing, and that you must stick to that, always avoid error, it may be that you are giving up the chance to know the truth, because you have to risk error in order to gain the truth. Well, if James is setting up these as options for us, like options in our lives as we move on and try to understand more about the world, he is certainly emphasizing the former over the latter. That is, to James, it's more important to follow the imperative to know the truth than the other imperative to avoid error. Of course, we should avoid error when possible. But it may be that in order to gain the truth sometimes that we have to risk falling into error. He gets a little bit, I don't know, sketchy at the end, because the view is really opening up here in terms of what he really thinks and what this philosophy that we would call pragmatism really means. For one thing, it may be that our notions of truth are a little bit narrow. That is, that the search for a criterion of truth might have been too narrow, too close-minded. That truth may not consist in matching up with an objective world. It may be much more complicated than that. And it may be that in order to gain the truth, we have to make the first move, and that's a very religious sort of way of putting it. That is, that just as in social matters, sometimes it takes an act of faith, sort of ungrounded act of faith in order to make something happen. It may be that cognitively, it may take kind of an act of faith to achieve something like truth. He talks about, the question, do you like me? Do you like me or not? It's on page 23. But he says, whether you do or not depends in countless instances on whether I meet you halfway. I'm willing to assume that you must like me and show you trust and expectation. That is, the question, do you like me or not, is not really something that I am separated from. That is, my actions with regard to you may utterly affect the truth of that question, do you like me or not? It may be that I don't like you unless you like me, and you don't like me unless I like you. So somebody's got to like somebody first without having that reciprocity guaranteed in order to make the thing happen. Could knowledge be like that? Well, certainly, again, this is a sort of very religious thing. It seems to me that in a way he's rehearsing the old I believe so that I may understand, something in Latin somewhere. That is, that faith is needed before knowledge can come. And some of you, I think, suggested that that's what Anselm was getting at, and maybe in a larger perspective that was what he was getting at, although I insist that he thought that his argument, his ontological argument for the existence of God, was self-contained and self-sufficient for proving God's existence without faith. But in the larger picture, it may be that faith is necessary before knowledge can come, and there is a paradox there, and that's certainly where people like Descartes and Sextus, perhaps Plato and Aristotle, draw the line. Why should I give my faith over to something that that my reason doesn't consent to? And because reason is all I have, really. Reason is my only tool as a human being for finding truth, seemingly, so why should I throw it away? There is that notion that we have to make the first move cognitively, that it may be that we have to risk error in order to gain truth. And maybe that's not too far from what science does. And after all, modern science is very much influential in James's way of thinking. An interesting remark about being a scientist or being an empiricist, that is, not accepting anything that's not based upon evidence. It says on page 17, but please observe now that when, as empiricists, we give up the doctrine of objective certitude, that is, we give up the idea that we absolutely know anything, we do not thereby give up the quest or hope of truth itself. That is, just because we realize that we have no criterion of truth does not mean that we should stop searching for it. We still pin our faith on its existence and still believe that we gain an ever better position towards it. One wonders on what that faith is based, except pure faith itself, that we are getting into a continually better position with regard to the truth, that is getting closer to the truth. We still pin our faith on its existence and still believe that we gain an ever better position towards it by systematically continuing to roll up experiences and think. Our great difference from the scholastic, and one may think of Anselm as an example of kind of scholastic, lies in the way we face, that is, which direction are we going and which direction are we facing. The strength of his system, of the scholastic, lies in the principles, the origin, the terminus a quo, or the starting point, the limit from which, the starting point of his thought. And one may say that Aristotle, at least the Aristotle we read, is somewhat similar. That is, what is the strength of Anselm's position? It is his principles that he starts from. The strength of his position lies in the principles, the origin, the terminus a quo of his thought. For us, we empiricists, the strength is in the outcome, the upshot, the terminus ad quem, the finishing point, the limit to which. Not where it comes from, but what it leads to is to decide. That is, science, that is, does not believe it has unshakable first principles that are absolutely certain and are the absolute rock-solid foundation of all the details to follow. Rather, modern science and empiricism knows that it has no absolute foundation, yet it's moving forward. It's not looking back on the absolute truth of its first principles, the Aristotelian starting points, I say, Euclidean starting points in terms of mathematics, but rather science and the empirical spirit, the empiricist spirit, is looking forward to truth, not looking back. Not where it comes from, but what it leads to is to decide. It matters not to an empiricist from what quarter an hypothesis may come to him. He may have acquired it by fair means or by foul. Passion may have whispered, or accident suggested it. But if the total drift of thinking continues to confirm it, that is what he means by its being true. Is that a different notion of the criterion of truth? Rather than having a principle, a rule, a definite method for sorting out true beliefs from other things, it's put a little more vaguely, and I think intentionally vague. He refers to the total drift of thinking, which continues to confirm it. That is, whatever hypothesis we're working with. Which seems to me to say that there is no one definite, concisely statable method for finding truth, but rather it's a vague, ongoing thing where the total drift of thinking can confirm or disconfirm something. And of course, what does that mean? It means that we're risking untruth. That is, that we try on hypotheses, perhaps because they're live, because they're genuine options, not dead ones. And they seem right to us, and we try them on, we work with them, we do our best with them. For instance, the idea perhaps that virtue is knowledge. If we go all the way back to the Meno, we can't confirm it, but absolutely, but it may be the total drift of our thinking seems to confirm it in an ongoing way, never absolutely, but in a fairly, one may say, practical or pragmatic way. That seems to be a big part of pragmatism. The notion that certainty is not something that we're ever going to get outside of very limited fields like perhaps, and even this is questionable, logic and mathematics. That what we have to learn to deal with is that any of our opinions, it's possible to disconfirm them. It's possible that they could be untrue, but that is a risk that we take if we're going to sort of have any hope of moving forward cognitively and trying to find truth about things that are quite important to us.